Paternal Family History. Here we have the case note of Suzy's meeting with Mike, Johnny and Tara's dad. As usual, we have the letter to Johnny and Tara. In this one, she mentions the concept of trauma. She doesn't go into a lot of explaining about what that is. It's fine to assume that they'll have access to information when they're adults. She explains that she ended the conversation with their father early, why that was, and that she didn't get to talk to Mike about Tara. Again, that this shows that it wasn't an oversight, but a decision, and that it's still on the table for the next meeting that she's going to have with Mike. So let's look at the case note. Suzy begins this record by recording Mike's presentation, his punctuality, and including whether she could see any signs that he'd been drinking. Suzy's observant of Mike's non-verbal expression, just as she has been with the children and with Lucy. Recording this gives additional information about the context of the conversation to the reader. For example, in case someone thinks that Mike's emotional state later on in the meeting was influenced by him possibly being drunk, this gives some evidence that Suzy considered this and did not think that that was the case. Suzy gives Mike the chance to give his views before the discussion, and she records his responses. She's using quote marks to highlight what he said and to give a clear impression of how Mike was emotionally when talking about it. She records some of his body language as being antsy, which is a little bit subjective, but we kind of know what that means, and that is his body language, and so therefore part of what he was communicating. Mike's statement about wanting to know what to do to make it right is change talk, which Suzy recognises and uses as a means to reassure Mike that she can see that he wants to do the right thing before talking about what this actually means. Change talk, if you're interested, is part of motivational interviewing. If you want to hear more about that, there's quite a lot of stuff on YouTube. Anyway, with this, Suzy demonstrates that she's being respectful of Mike's views, but also appropriately professionally sceptical as well. Which leads into talking about his family. In getting Mike's family history, Suzy follows the same rule of three that I spoke about during her chat with Lucy. Quick reminder, the first part is history back to the children's grandparents' childhood. The second part is history of the parents' relationship before they had children. And the third part is the history of the family since having children. Suzy allows Mike to talk and records the basics of his family. She notes a non-verbal cue at one point which causes her to ask further questions, which is how she hears about Mike's sister dying when she was quite young. Where Suzy talks about the non-verbal stuff like this, it helps convey Mike's state of mind during the conversation, and again shows that Suzy is using her social work skills during the conversation. If she just recorded, Mike told me about his parents and two siblings, including a sister who died aged 3, well, that would be the facts of the family makeup, but those aren't the only facts that were present during this conversation. The emotional difficulty Mike apparently was having when talking about this is just as important to the conversation as the bare information that he's giving. But Suzy isn't using words which describe Mike's emotions, at least not yet. She's only describing his behaviour, so his tone of voice, his body language, etc., and using those descriptions to convey his emotions. This is because those are the things that she can actually observe. She can't read his mind, but she can see him when he takes a deep breath before saying something meaningful, or hear something in his voice, even if she can't say exactly what that is. A reader who sees that uses their own understanding of people to interpret that body language. Later, Suzy does start to use words like upset and angry, but by this time she's described enough of what she sees, so the occasional subjective term like that is less vague than if she'd used it without the context of the behaviour that she's already described. She also uses the word upset when she's talking to Mike about how he feels, and he doesn't contradict her, which implies that she's correct, or at least close enough. If she says, "You seem upset," and he says, "Well, no, I'm not," that's kind of like a bit of a fact check or a reality check on her interpretation. But if he doesn't say anything, or if he says, "Yes, I'm upset," then that's sort of showing that she's on the right track. Now, it might be that he denies being upset when he very much is upset, and that's where you would just be very clear about why you think he's upset. So, crying, raised voice, stamping his feet like a toddler, I don't know, whatever it is, you put that in. Anyway, Suzy moves on to part 2 of the rule of 3, the relationship Mike and Lucy had before having children. Mike gives his version of events of how he felt when they first met and started going out. He acknowledges some insecurity, which Suzy demonstrates by quoting Mike's exact words. Suzy reflects what Mike says about not letting Lucy's family's treatment of him bother him, and uses it to try and explore further, but Mike doesn't give much information. Suzy, however, has recorded that she asked the question, making her good practice visible. That it didn't get much information doesn't take away that she was doing good work. Record that you ask these sorts of questions, like Suzy has here. Same with the next paragraph. Suzy uses her discretion and quotes to show how she was able to engage Mike, encourage his own reflection, and continue hearing about his relationship with Lucy when she fell pregnant. Moving on to the final of our 3 rules, after Johnny was born, Suzy continues to use Mike's words to highlight elements of his story. Suzy chooses words which show Mike's view of his relationship with Lucy, with her family, and what family means to him. Mike wants perfection for his wife and children. Suzy uses the discussion about COVID to transition to talking about Mike's drinking during that period. This shows his history with alcohol and how it appears that he thinks of some things as being normal, at least in the context of his own childhood. Note that this is out of sequence with the rule of 3, talking about his childhood here. It even has its own subheading, drinking. This shows how the rule of 3 is more of a guideline, but honestly, guideline of 3 just doesn't sound as cool. Since alcohol use is such a significant part of the case, treating it separately can make a bit of sense, especially when you know you're going to come back to a passage regularly when writing your assessment or engaging in reflective analysis. Even though it's separate from the rest of the history, Suzy still uses quotes, records her good practice, and Mike's non-verbal communication. Talking about alcohol use leads on to discussing the recent incident, and Mike gives his version of events and his thoughts. Suzy then brings up her hypothesis that Mike's drinking and related emotions that Lucy described may be linked to his sister's death. It quickly becomes apparent that this was probably a mistake. Suzy reflects inaction on this and doesn't try to cover up for herself. She notes Mike's change in demeanour, as this is informative to his state of mind. She also records that his answers become much briefer and closed. Before finishing up, Mike has some questions, so Suzy answers them and discusses her concerns about the video message he sent. She describes how she handled the situation. She's polite and respectful, but firm and clear about Mike's situation regarding seeing his children. She doesn't step outside her own professional limits, so she isn't giving legal advice or anything that she's not qualified to do. By recording how she manages this situation, she's both showing her good practice, but also creating a contemporaneous record of the conversation, in case Mike does something silly and tries to say, "Well, Suzy said it was fine." That might sound slightly paranoid, but believe me, it's not. where someone asks you if they are allowed to do something that both of you know full well that they shouldn't, keeping a record like this can be very helpful. Finally, the analysis. Suzy records her thoughts about how the discussion went, both positive aspects and otherwise. These are her early thoughts and reflections on what happened. They're her views and impressions now, so that she can look back on them and reflect when she gets a bit more information. She notes Mike's use of the word perfect, as it contrasts so significantly with his own upbringing. Suzy also records that there were topics of the discussion which did not happen, but will be picked up next time.